They need to be aware of the history of it, and they need to have a responsibility to make sure it never happens again. So they are directly tied in because racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, it affects everybody. And sometimes white people think they're exonerated from racism. I'm not a racist. It doesn't affect me. Of course they're affected by it. One of our speakers says, and I love this quote, if my brother or sister's not free, I'm not free.
Hello and welcome to the special Father's Day edition of the Mother's Quest podcast. In this episode, I'm honored to feature Jeff Steinberg, whose commitment to the lessons of the civil rights movement can shine a light for us now during another pivotal time in our nation's history. Jeff and I first crossed paths when our sons, Ryan and Journey, now 20 years old, became inseparable friends in preschool. While waiting to pick up our kids, I instantly connected with Jeff as I learned about the transformative work he was doing as Executive Director of Sojourn to the Past, also known as the Sojourn Project. Years before I would create Mother's Quest, Jeff modeled the power of forging his own purposeful path. After 14 years of teaching AP American history, Jeff founded Sojourn to move beyond the limitations of the classroom, delving students into the lessons of the civil rights movement and bringing history to life. Through week-long journeys to the South, students visit historic locations, delve into primary source materials, hear from civil rights icons, and engage in deep discussions. By stepping out of the classroom, students are immersed in a shared history not covered in our textbooks. They return empowered to drive personal, social, and civic change in their own communities. Since his first trip in 1999, Jeff has received tremendous recognition for his impact, receiving state and national awards, including the Coretta Scott King Angel Award and the National Arts and Humanities Youth Programs Award. He has led over 10,000 students and community adults on these transformative journeys, shaping their futures in profound ways. To share more about the impact of Sojourn on her life, I invited an alum of the program, Christy Donna Ng, to give this episode's dedication.
Hello, I'm Christy Donna Ng, and I'm honored to dedicate this episode of the Mother's Quest podcast to Mr. Jeff Steinberg and the icons of the civil rights movement who paved the way for a more just and equal society. In the year 2000 as a student and in 2001 as a student teacher, I went on a life-changing experience with Mr. Steinberg's organization, the Sojourn Project, where we visited key locations of the civil rights movement and met with heroes of the movement like Congressman John Lewis, Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, and Minnie Jean Brown Trickey, just to name a few. But more than just the places and the people, Mr. Steinberg teaches his students mantras that I still live by to this day: to practice nonviolence, to not be a silent witness to injustice, to be an ambassador of peace. If you don't vote, you don't count. That ordinary people can do extraordinary things, and so much more. Mr. Steinberg has taught generations of students how to be empathetic, compassionate, strong, powerful leaders. How lucky we are to have him. Being a part of Sojourn has impacted my life and career. I received a master's in politics from NYU and worked at Human Rights Watch for several years before switching to acting and screenwriting. Even now, I only choose projects that have a positive impact on society and no violent language in the script. My husband and I are parents to a beautiful Nigerian Chinese American girl, and surprise, we are expecting a baby boy in August. Sometimes I think about young African American boys whose lives were cut too short. I wonder how many years of peace I have with my son before I have to worry about somebody doing him wrong. Emmett Till was just 14 years old. Tamir Rice was only 12. So 12 years of peace is maybe all I get. But yet, I'm hopeful I will get more years or even a lifetime of peace. Because so long as there are heroes and fathers like Mr. Steinberg teaching the next generation of students to use their voices to speak out against injustice, I know we are heading towards a more peaceful and just society. So thank you, Mr. Steinberg. Yes, I still call you Mr. Steinberg. And happy Father's Day.
Thank you, Christy, for sharing about your personal story of transformation through the Sojourn Project. how your experience influenced your purposeful path, and the hope that Sojourn's work gives you when you worry about your own children's future. I loved this opportunity to go deep with Jeff into the lessons and mantras that you learned through Sojourn. The belief that ordinary people can do extraordinary things, and that we all have a role to play to speak out against injustice. Jeff shares honestly about his own personal grappling with our nation's history, the principles of nonviolence, and the issues we face today, including the horrors unfolding in Israel and Palestine and the protests that have taken place here. While you might not agree with everything he says, I hope the thoughtful perspectives he shares inspires you, as it did me, to say yes to a Sojourn trip of your own and to move with authenticity into your own transformational activism. I'm Julie Neal, and this is Mother's Quest. My friend Jeff Steinberg, welcome to the Mother's Quest podcast for the special Father's Day edition. It's an honor to have you here.
An honor to be here, and congratulations on all your success. You are an advocate who's helping change society. And so it's a privilege to be here with you.
I really appreciate that, especially from you. I feel like some of my time learning about Sojourn Project and the work you do in the world definitely inspired me. And I'm excited to get a chance to talk about that and about your being a father and also some of what's happening in the world and insights that I'm sure you'll have from all the work that you've done around activism. So let's get started. The first question I ask every guest is, tell me a little bit about your own mother and the impact that she has had on you. And before you answer, I have to say, I'm so excited that I get to ask you this because I've often said to you, you have two other brothers and the three of you are all compassionate, social justice-minded change makers in your own way. And I have often thought, what did your mom and your dad do as you were growing up to help shape these three incredible human beings? So I'm so excited to hear what you have to say.
Well, thank you. And again, it's so great to be here. My mom is 87. My dad's 91. And so I feel very blessed to have both of them. They've been married for 67 years this year. And my mom was incredible growing up. She was kind. She was supportive. One of my memories is, and I don't know whether it's a good thing for my father, when she and my father would argue or it was about us, Mom always took our sides. She was always on our side and getting my father to shift. So we always knew that she had our back. She came from a very religious family. Her father was an Orthodox Jew, and faith was important to her and traditions were important to her. And I think she's instilled that in us, the faith and traditions. My younger brother is a rabbi, and my older brother is the mayor of Sacramento. And public service and giving back, I think, is crucial to who my parents were. They weren't very political, and yet we all have kind of a political bent to us, including my older brother. It kind of started from him. And I remember him bringing things home, speeches of Dr. King, speeches of the Kennedy brothers, John and Bobby, and me, who's 2.5 years younger than my older brother, listening to those, and then the family having discussions about those, because I grew up in the 60s. I was a preteen in the 60s, and then the 70s, I was a teenager in high school, and having discussions with our folks around the dinner table about society and racism and our role in this as a Jewish family. So mom is just so loving and kind, and I always feel blessed to have her.
Well, that brings me to another question I think is important to start with, which is, what do you feel like you have most been on a quest for in your life? And how is that showing up for you today?
I think about the principles of nonviolence daily. They are kind of my North Star and guiding light. There are 6 principles that were done by Dr. King and a man named Jim Lawson, Reverend Jim Lawson, who was instrumental in the civil rights movement. And Gandhi certainly ties into this as well. But principles such as nonviolence as a way of life for courageous people. Nonviolence seeks to win friendship and understanding. You don't humiliate somebody, you try and win over their friendship and understanding. Nonviolence realizes education is the path, and willingly accepts the consequences to its acts. Nonviolence knows the universe is on the side of justice. The nonviolent resistor has deep faith justice will eventually win. And those are kind of my mantras. I say the last one to me frequently because in the work I do, it's oftentimes walking up a hill backwards, pushing a boulder, anti-racism work, social justice work. But I always say to myself, the universe is on the side of justice, and you know you're on the right path, even when it doesn't feel like it sometimes because of outside noise. So the principles have helped me find my inner peace. And I don't know if I'm there yet. I don't even know if I practice these principles entirely. One of the principles that I left out says, nonviolence realizes evildoers are also victims. I get it conceptually. I struggle with it that Adolf Hitler was a victim. But somebody has said to me, people have said to me in the civil rights movement, if you were brought up a racist or a white supremacist, wouldn't you be a victim as well if you're perpetuating that because of how you're brought up? I get it. I struggle with it. So I'm not there yet with all these principles. But I always tell young people, and I tell myself, it's a lifelong process and it's a learning process. So my goal is for me, I don't say happiness, I say inner peace. I don't feel like I get there a lot because I live in gray. And people have inner peace. I don't know whether they always live in gray.
How did your connection to these principles and to the civil rights leaders that you learned about from your brother? I love that story. How did that lead you to founding Sojourn Project?
Well, I was a teacher for 14 years at Capuchino High School, which is located in San Bruno, California. And I taught U.S. history, AP, other levels. And I just decided my last year at the school that people don't get it. And I say it on purpose. Understand what real nonviolence is about, real courage, that language is a form of violence, institutionalized racism, forgiveness, but I also differentiate forgiveness versus apologies because forgiveness ties into the Christian hegemony where apologies are a different thing to me, but it's all somewhat tied in together. And I just wanted to take 30 kids from my own class into the Deep South. My last year at the high school, I took 100 the first year. And I realized really quickly, this wasn't just for my students. This was for anybody who had passion and heart. And we took a number of students on the trip who I call struggling students, nice young people, nice kids, as we say, but struggling students. And it made me realize very quickly that this wasn't just for these kids. So I took a leave of absence from the district I taught in. The San Mateo district had never given a teacher more than a 2-year leave. They cut you loose after 2 years. They gave me 7 years in a row.
Wow.
And then they said, please resign. So I resigned. I formed a nonprofit organization called Sojourn Project. We now also go by Sojourn to the Past. We also go by Sojourn Project. And we're 24 years in now. We've taken 19,000 people. I've presented the program to 500,000. And I call it riding the wave. I don't know how long it continues, but with today's politics, there seems to be a need for it in the themes that we teach, discuss, and implement from the experience.
It's really incredible what you have done. And in many ways, I feel like you were so many years ahead of your time in terms of bringing these topics to communities that were not looking at it. We're not being open enough to really do the deep work around this history and then what it means for each of us today in terms of how we can actually work towards anti-racism in ourselves and in our own communities and in our own institutions. What was it like to see some change in terms of these issues being brought much more into the forefront? And it also feels like now it feels like the tide is changing again, where there was so much emphasis on diversity, equity, inclusion work. And now it's all coming under fire in so many really frightening ways, I think. I'd love to get your bird's eye view of a more historical account of how this is all unfolding.
It's shameful because we can't make social change unless we know our history. And America, as beautiful as it is, has an ugly history in so many ways. I mean, the original sin of slavery. Thomas Jefferson in 1781 wrote something called the Notes on Virginia. In the Notes on Virginia, he talked about how Black people smelled. He called their lovemaking animalistic coupling. And he said he had never heard a Black person utter anything other than a plain narrative. And then he went on to say, all Black people were inferior to white people. Well, that theme is still today, superior and inferior. So from the founding fathers to today, we still see those themes trying to be implemented by different institutions. And the pushback against what we're doing is incredible, but we've made some major paths. An example, I don't even think you know this in our friendship. We started taking police officers. I've now done 4 trips and taken 200 police officers and 25 district attorneys in 4 trips. And the chief of police of San Francisco, who's an incredible man, his name is Bill Scott. He's a reformer. He gets it. He called me and said, Jeff, I need all my officers to come on this trip because they need to see what happened during the civil rights movement to people of color. And I am sure once they experience this, they'll be more empathetic and compassionate on the streets. So we've had
Wow.
this now going into our 4th year, or 3rd or 4th year working with the police. And Chief Scott comes on every trip. He comes on every trip. The district attorney of San Francisco, a woman named Brooke Jenkins, she is bringing her district attorneys on this trip, and they're bringing their staffs and officers because they know education is the key. And what they do each night is we do all the historical stuff through the day, and then the nighttime is devoted to how the lessons of the civil rights movement and the anti-racism lessons apply to policing today. And it's led by Chief Scott and Brooke Jenkins. And it is just an incredible to be part of because we have 4 different levels we do. We do middle schools, we've taken high schools, and now we're doing police and district attorneys. And then this past year, I got phone calls from community organizations. And so we've taken now different community organizations whose mantra is, how do we fight against the ills of society, meaning racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, because people need to see themselves reflected in the work, and they need to know they're standing on shoulders of people who have paved this way. People have said, those who don't know the past are condemned to repeat it. Those who forget the past are condemned to repeat it. So we have an obligation to people in the movement and what I do is I'm teaching about the civil rights movement and the connections and all the themes. But there's also the long civil rights movement that people don't talk about. And the long civil rights movement is from the 1607, when the original sins of this country happened and how families stuck together and fought for equality. That's the long civil rights movement. Most people know 55 to 68, which is the era of Rosa Parks to Dr. King or Emmett Till to Dr. King. But it goes way, way beyond that. And these themes are critical in today's society for young people to know, but for institutions to know as well. And tackling the institution of policing has been an amazing journey. There's been pushback, even from people who join us on the journeys. But yet, by the end of the journey, I think people see the transformative process that can happen. In policing, for instance, they are the epitome of the principles of nonviolence. And it took me a few trips to get it. And somebody said, how can policing be nonviolent? If police really follow the principles of nonviolence, I think we reform policing. The first principle, nonviolence is a way of life for courageous people. Who should be more courageous than our officers? Nonviolence seeks to win friendship and understanding. If they're on the streets, winning friendship and understanding with people, not any brutality, not aggressiveness, but friendship and understanding. Nonviolence realizes evildoers are also victims. I mean, I see all these principles tying into policing, and I think that's one of the themes we work on.
I feel like we could do a whole episode about that because I have so many questions just about how the whole system needs to be reformed. Because in some of my understanding of the history, policing really did come up after those who were enslaved were free.
Absolutely. That's where it was founded.
Yeah. And so when you have the roots of something that it's begun on a foundation of oppression, it's so hard to see, like, how do you begin to change the institution? But some of what I'm hearing from you is that you begin with making change from within those who have power.
And knowing the history of our country. You have to know the history of our country. We have a documentary that's being worked on. It's not there yet. And a white officer went up to a woman who's 98 years old now, whose husband was murdered in 1966. His name is Vernon Damer, Dahmer, and he's helping people register to vote. And his house was firebombed by the Klan. He's an African-American man, as is his wife and family. And she meets every group I bring at age 98. And she went up to meet Mrs. Damer after. And Mrs. Damer said to her, "Why don't you protect people like us?" And she said it was the most moving part of her experience because she was taken back. And she had to really reflect on the history of our country. It wasn't personal to her as an officer. It was talking about the institution. And I think it was a transformative piece for her that she and the institution have to be part of the solution. And that's caught on film. And so it's very exciting. Second piece I'd like to share, if I may, I was just recommended yesterday to watch a new documentary. It's on Netflix. It is called Power. It is about the history of policing from the time of people being enslaved to present day. And I just watched it today. So it's very fresh for me. And it moved me in an incredible way. It's very hard to watch. And one of the Little Rock Nine, who's a dear friend of mine, her name is Minnie Jean Brown Trickey, the Little Rock Nine being the first Black student to desegregate schools in the Deep South. She's 82 years old. She watched it last night and she texted me and said, "I'm loving this film and I'm hating this film."
Ooh.
That was my takeaway as well. So if any of your listeners get a chance to watch it, it certainly ties into a lot of the work you do as well.
We will absolutely include links in the show notes. I want to bring this to what I call the EPIC guideposts. I know you've listened to some of the episodes in the past. So EPIC is this big picture acronym for following our own hero's journey in a way that I have observed you doing and the work you do in the world. And then it's also an acronym mnemonic for the guideposts that I think help us to live that way, especially in the years when we're raising our children. And so I would love to just get your insights about each guidepost. And the first one, E, is about engaging mindfully with our children. I'd love to know the lessons you've learned in your, raising your own two sons about how to engage mindfully, but also, I think that you do father and parent in certain ways all of the young people and the students that you've brought on these trips. So what would you say are some of the biggest lessons you've learned about really reaching them and mindfully engaging with them?
Well, I'm really proud of my two sons, as you have two amazing sons yourself. I have a 21 and 19-year-old, and I've been involved in this work for 24 years. And so it can't help but be part of who my boys are. My oldest son's name is Justice. I wanted to name him Martin after Dr. King, Medgar after Medgar Evers, John after John Lewis, Vernon after Vernon Damer, and Fred after Fred Shuttle, Martin, Medgar, Vernon, John, Fred Steinberg. His mom wouldn't let me do that. So his name is Justice. And you can't help but be brought up in a family like ours where we have a lot of the civil rights icons spend the night and sleep over without being a little transformed yourself. And what I've really tried to instill with my boys, it's not about hero worshiping. It's about the mantra, ordinary people can do extraordinary things. And that's the mantra given to me by people in the civil rights movement, particularly Minnie Jean Brown and Elizabeth Eckford, two of the Little Rock Nine. And that's one of my missions to pass on with my boys, is that they have to know what's going on. And being young Jewish kids has not been easy always, because they have seen some of the synagogue shootings that felt very personal to them. They've seen security when they were going through Sunday school. They have moved away from the religion in a major way, or I don't think the faith and traditions, but the religion, and they get to form their own paths. One of the Little Rock Nine was at my house when the school where those 20 young children were shot up a number of years ago, and Minnie Jean was here. And I said, I'm not sure how to negotiate this with my sons. And I turned down all the volumes, but I had the screens on because I wanted to see it. And my young son, who I believe was 5 or 6, came in and said, "Why would all these children be shot?" And Minnie Jean sat with me as we talked to him. And he said, "Is this going to happen at our school?" And it was very moving for me that we have to be real and we have to be honest. And, we have to be age level appropriate, of course, but honest that we live in a society that needs a lot of work, and they have to be kind young people who have to help with the work. And whatever field they choose to go into, they're not going into the field I'm in, but they can't help but be part of it. Like I can't help with my brother bringing home the Dr. King and Bobby Kennedy and John Kennedy stuff. It seeped into me. Osmosis is an amazing thing. And we have these discussions frequently.
Thank you for sharing that, Jeff. Let's move into the next guidepost, P, which is passionate and purposeful impact. I want to build off of what you're saying about the work that you do with young people and amplifying voices. How have you seen these journeys that you take young people on and the conversations that you have been able to facilitate between people with real differences? How have you seen that make a real difference in the lives of the communities of these young people when they return from their trips?
It's such an interesting question you ask, and you left out one word because there's a word you do in your work that needs to be acknowledged, and that's transformative work. When you're hearing people's stories and they're sharing their lessons, that's a transformative process. And so that's one of the key words that we do on Sojourn is we hope people have transformation. And I don't ever say it's going to happen. The trips are between 7 and 10 days oftentimes. I don't say it's going to happen in 7 days. It may not be 7 weeks. It may not be 7 months. But somewhere down the line, by meeting these icons of the civil rights movement, knowing our country's history, and then being reflective, self-reflective, you're going to be hit. Somewhere in your life, you are going to be hit and transformation is going to take place. I believe that. I'll give you one story. We took a student who had white supremacist leanings. This is a number of years ago. And his school really wanted him to come on the trip. He was on the peninsula. And so we took him on the trip and he had this amazing transformative experience. So I get a call about a week after he comes home and saying he's been institutionalized. And I got really panicked. So I called my mentor, Minnie Jean Brown, one of the Little Rock Nine, and I said, this isn't supposed to happen. We're not supposed to have kids institutionalized once they come home from the experience. And this is the only time this has happened that I know of. And she said, I'm not surprised it doesn't happen more often. We're taking people's worlds that they have a firm belief in and we're turning them upside down.
Yeah.
And then they go back to the area they live in with the same families that had white supremacist leanings. And she said, so this doesn't surprise me at all because they are hearing things they've never heard before and oftentimes truth they've never heard before. So their world is being turned upside down. So when the young person got released, he contacted me and he ended up working for Sojourn for a period of time.
Wow.
It was a beautiful story, but we're taking people's worlds and we're asking them to look differently.
Yeah.
And everyone has stuff inside of them. It's what we do with this stuff. Here's one thing I say. I don't think anger is a bad thing. I have anger in me. Anger turned positive is social action. Anger turned negative is destruction. So how do we turn this angst that so many of us have, especially in today's society, and turn it positive? Activism takes place in so many different ways. You don't have to be beaten or to be arrested to be an activist. Musicians are activists. Artists are activists. Spoken word is activists. So there's so many ways to do activism. Your son, Ryan, who I have been following on your podcast, he is an activist. He is working with people to help them have an experience and oftentimes a transformative experience. And people who don't get acknowledged very often or fall through the cracks. And so activism has many different shades to it. And I'm really proud of what we do through education is transformative activism. I have had, in the 24 years I've done Sojourn, I must have close to 200 letters from young people who call this one of the defining moments of their lives. And I need to say all these letters are unsolicited, who call this one of the defining moments of their lives and has put them on a path and the path for what they do today. I was just told yesterday, there's a young man who's now in his 30s who came on the trip and he's now working in government. And this put him on a path to want to change institutionalized policies in government. And I hear stories like that frequently in different aspects of life.
I knew that I would have some moments of tears in this conversation. So I'm feeling very teary about the story about this young person whose world was turned upside down as he had to understand his experience and the stories that had shaped him in new ways and find a new path forward. I'm also just really moved by this reminder that activism looks many different ways and that we can all come to our own transformative moment to find our own path. I definitely relate to that very much in terms of my experiences.
And we all have a voice that needs to be acknowledged. I mean, part of the goal here is what happens when you study moments of the civil rights movement, which are often very painful, with the hope that the lesson is about hope and what can we do differently. But my experience is when you show footage from the 1960s, 1950s of stories, students of color oftentimes feel shame. White kids oftentimes feel guilt. And those are both destructive feelings because we want to get people together without having to feel shame or guilt. And this is what I say to white kids, for instance. As a Jewish person, a 17-year-old German student is not responsible for the Holocaust. They did not do it, but they need to know about it. They need to be aware of the history of it, and they need to have a responsibility to make sure it never happens again. So they are directly tied in because racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, it affects everybody. And sometimes white people think they're exonerated from racism. I'm not a racist. It doesn't affect me. Of course they're affected by it. One of our speakers says, and I love this quote, if my brother or sister is not free, I'm not free. I'm actually fighting for my own freedom. And that's an incredible quote to me said by a white activist in the civil rights movement. And I think about it a lot. Now, we don't want students of color to feel shame either. We want them to feel empowered that they have voice and they have power and they're standing on shoulders of people who've already paved a path so they can make a difference as well. So there's a lot of intangibles at work.
So when you reached out to me, and actually, I love that you did this. You said, I've been waiting for you to invite me on your podcast. And the minute I saw that text, especially in the backdrop of what's going on in our world right now, and especially what's happening in Israel and Palestine, I knew that this was the right moment to have you on, especially for this Father's Day episode. I really want to, even though it's challenging, I want to talk about what it means then for us as Jewish Americans witnessing the ongoing oppression of the Palestinian people and what's currently happening in Gaza as a reflection of what you were just saying. As Jewish Americans, we may not be directly responsible, although our government is complicit in many ways. But how do we reconcile this? And I'll just say one other thing. I think I stepped into my anti-racism journey. I began to have to relearn the narratives of the history of our own country and see things in new ways. And I have, over the years, already been doing that work, but even more so since October 7th, relearning some of the narratives that we get as Jewish Americans about the founding of Israel and about the source of the conflict. So I'm just teeing up an uncomfortable conversation. How do we approach this?
It's a fair conversation, and we have to be honest. I mean, and we have to be transparent. It's taken me a while to get to where I'm at today. I have two brothers. We're all in a little bit different positions, and we're all public people. So the first thing I say, and it's taken me a while to do it, is acknowledge the G word. We must call something a genocide when it's a genocide. And I didn't do it after October 7th. I didn't do it through November and December. And I've come to it that if we're going to be really true to the work and transparent in humanity, we have to call things what they are. And when 36,000 Palestinians have been killed, murdered, we have to call it what it is. Too many families have been destroyed. I was at USF about 3 weeks ago, and I walked to one of the encampments, and I was talking to a Palestinian young woman, and she could not have been more lovely. And I told her who I was, and I told her a little bit of my background, and we just had the best dialogue. And the way I synthesize it is I start with this. I believe in a Jewish state. I believe in a two-state solution. Now, I know that's not popular amongst young people right now or amongst many people, but I believe in a state of Israel, and I believe in a Palestinian free and independent state without Israel occupation, including Gaza and the West Bank. So I said to her, as I was in the encampments, I said, tell me, please, is it safe for you here? And it was so interesting. Some people started coming around taking pictures, and they put on masks when pictures were taken. She didn't have a mask when we started talking. She put it on as pictures were taken because they don't know how these pictures are going to be used. And she said, no, we have not had any trouble with Zionists. And I said, that's a really hard word for me because I was brought up the term Zionist to mean belief in a Jewish state. And the word has been so corrupted now to say one uses Zionist to believe in a Jewish state is a very minority opinion, to say the least. I said to her, she said, how do you justify the history of Israel? I said, well, what I do is October 7th and Israel's response with this genocide are two different events to me. And people may disagree. October 7th was tragic, but I have to also acknowledge there's a history that leads to October 7th with the founding of Israel. And I don't know enough about it in my own studies because this is another piece. I said this to my brother the other day. I went 10 years of Sunday school. I was bar mitzvahed. And I am sure as anything, it was never explicitly said, but I am so sure of this, that we were indoctrinated that Jews are superior and Arabs are inferior. It was never said that way. But the messages I received as a young Jewish person were those messages every day, superior and inferior, which is just the stuff I teach about in the civil rights movement. And I have to acknowledge that. So I have to deal with my own stuff and my own background to work through it to get to a place that I can find this inner peace I was talking about. And one was acknowledging the genocide that has occurred. But acknowledging also, for me, October 7th was tragic. It was horrible. It was murderous. But there's a history that led to October 7th. Now, the way people did October 7th, I would vehemently disagree with till the end of time. I'm a big supporter of the encampments. I think the encampments are the highest form of social justice and social action. Minnie Jean of the Little Rock Nine says this line that I love. When the Little Rock Nine were doing their thing of desegregating Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, President Eisenhower had to send in troops to protect them. So Minnie Jean's line is, young people can make presidents act. Well, the encampments have done that. Joe Biden has had to act, and he's had to take positions, oftentimes antithetical to the positions I would agree with. But he's had to take positions so young people can make presidents act. I think now, where it crosses the line for me, if students aren't allowed to go to school or classes, if there's any racist language said, Islamophobic language or anti-Semitic language, that crosses my boundaries. Totally disagree with it. But at the encampments for social protests, I'm really proud of. So to acknowledge that and to acknowledge that there's a history. And October 7th, as tragic as it is, we must acknowledge the history. But my challenge is, and I've talked to Jewish people, a lot of Jewish people who are very supportive of Israel. How do we find peace? How does this end? There must be a ceasefire. Of course there must be. But what is the end goal here? And the end goal for me is there must be a two-state solution. I just read recently that it's going to take 10 to 14 years to rebuild Gaza with all the destruction that's happened. That is unacceptable. After the United States dropped the atomic bomb on Japan, the United States was critical in the rebuilding of Japan with other allied countries. My expectation is, and now people tell me I have rose-colored glasses, that the United States, allied countries, even Israel, goes in and builds an independent Palestinian state that must coexist with the state of Israel. Now, I need to say it, Netanyahu is terrible, in my opinion, horrible. I just think he makes me ashamed. He makes me ashamed. He is not a leader I would ever support. And so this election we have coming up in November is probably the most important election in our country's history for a variety of reasons, including the United States' role with rebuilding Palestine to be an independent country. Now, I have been called and I've received messages from people calling me a self-hating Jew. And you know what? I just have to accept it. If I'm going to be a public person and speak out, people are entitled to their opinions. My goal is, how do we get people to sit down together? I have a dear friend who's principal of a high school in the San Mateo district. She's a Palestinian woman, and she has gone to San Mateo High School board meetings. And at the board meetings, she has been shut down. She has heard, somebody said to her, if I have it right, somebody asked if her son was the name of a terrorist. She has 2 children. And I wrote to the San Mateo High School District. I wrote to the superintendent. I wrote to the board. And I did not tell her about this. And I said, if you're not proactive protecting this person, I'm afraid you're going to eventually be reactive. And we have to be proactive and use our voices, especially people in the Jewish community, use our voices for our Palestinian brothers and sisters, and hopefully have deep, deep empathy and compassion for the loss they have suffered. I have not suffered any loss. I feel terrible that people are still hostage. It's been hostages. It's been 7 months. I feel terrible for the 1,000 plus people who died on October 7th. But we must acknowledge 36,000 people, including families of people we all know. And as Jews, we must reach out and let them know they do not stand alone. They cannot stand alone. It's not on my Palestinian friend, just like it's not on my African-American friends to say, hey, this is so racist and to stand, I'm the voice standing for it. No, it takes everybody else to stand up and say, we collectively come together. When anti-Semitism is real, there's no question about it. I've seen it, I have felt it, I've experienced it, but I don't want to be the one standing up and saying, this is going on right now. I want my collective beloved community, Dr. King called the beloved community, to stand up and say, we stand with you. We are opposed to anti-Semitism in all its forms. And the Palestinian people I know share that. They are not anti-Semitic. What my friend taught me as well, and I think this is so interesting, is when Palestinian people are protesting against the aggression, it is needed, their voices are needed. When anti-Semitism is occurring, who are the people doing the anti-Semitism? It's mostly white supremacists. It's mostly coming from the white supremacist community. It is not coming from the Palestinian community. And there is an entanglement in miscommunication and miseducation about this whole issue. And so for me, it has to be, honesty has to be acknowledged, and we have to make ourselves vulnerable so people can hopefully see in our hearts, and we can be standing with our friends who are oppressed and going through a genocide and be as helpful as we can. You know, the word allyship is really important, and we have to be allies. I want to make sure as I do the work I do, it is not white savior by any means. And I've heard the term white savior and I hate it. My job is to be an ally to communities of color. And if I'm a conduit to share in history for people who've been oppressed, then maybe that's the work I'm meant to do.
First of all, I want to acknowledge your honesty and your bravery in saying the words out loud. I've been really grappling with all of this, and I really resonate with so much of what you've said. And I appreciate the reminder about showing up for people in authentic ways and being in relationship with people. And some of the examples that you gave of your own activism during this time are because of real relationships that you have cultivated and being open to listening and to seeing the human being that's in front of you. I think that's so important.
And you are a truth teller. And to be a truth teller, I think for me, that trumps everything else I want to be about. I want to be a truth teller. Now, it doesn't mean when October 7th happened, I'll be very honest here, including some of my civil rights friends, I was deeply affected and really, really so troubled, tears. And there were people I expected to call me and to reach out to me who did not. And I addressed it with them in a gentle, kind way, even cried with them that I had not heard from them. And they had their reasons as well. They were in deep pain over what has happened, and they were dealing with their own pain. But I said, as my dear friend, I just hope you would have reached out to me and said, Jeff, are you okay? Mm-hmm. That's all I needed. Are you okay? And I feel that's my stuff as well to be able to do to my friends when issues come up that are not related to me directly, even though it's all related because we're all in this human experience together. But when George Floyd has happened, or Michael Brown has happened, or Trayvon Martin has happened, and congratulations on that amazing interview with Trayvon Martin's mother. I can't believe it's been 10 years and the lack of progress we've made in so many ways. But I reached out to as many of my friends as possible just to say, I want to know, are you okay? And I'm here. I wanted the same thing to happen, and I'm doing my best I can to make sure as stuff continues to happen that I don't become a hypocrite And I reach out to the people who I'm friends with, even if they don't get back to me, just to say, want to know you're okay and I'm here.
I think this is starting to move us into the next guidepost. I invested in ourself, because in activism work, there are a lot of uncomfortable emotions. And I want to uncover some of what you've learned about how to be able to be in this work. But building off of something you said, I also just want to ask you, I've heard that it's really important not to think that our activism is transactional. So that if I stand up and use my voice for someone else, then I expect in return. I hear this a lot from people in the Jewish community who are expressing a similar sense of hurt, but I'm also thoughtful about this not demanding a reciprocal response as like payback for I was there for you. Is any of this making sense? I feel like I'm very ineloquent today.
It's hard for me because I would never use the word payback.
Yeah.
I would use shared compassion.
Mm.
And when I'm going through stuff, I also want my circle to be reaching out to me. Not obligated to, but I'm a work in progress. I mean, that's how I look at it with this. I'm a work in progress. And the principles of nonviolence, which I think should be in every high school, middle school, grammar school in America, because that's peer mediation, actually, if they did those instead of the old arguments some schools in the South want to put up the 10 Commandments. The principles of nonviolence are peer mediation. But I'm not there yet. I'm 62 years old. I've been doing this for 24 years. I'm not there with those principles yet. I struggle with them. So I just call them, we're all works in progress.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's bad to have expectations for friends either. But I know what I hope would happen when it doesn't happen. And when I didn't get the call I wanted, it was from a civil rights person I'm very close with who's in her 80s. And we sat on a 3-hour bus ride and we talked, and tears were flowing from me. And she was as open and honest as she could have been with me as well. And it felt good to just be acknowledged and hear her and acknowledge what she also said. We're always going to be dear, but the transactional piece, which I think is a harsh way of saying it for me, maybe I fall into the category because I want to be reached out to when things are happening just as much as I want to give to other people. So I just call that a work in progress. If the goal is that you don't expect anything in return ever, I'm not there yet.
Yeah. And I like what you said about the goal is how do we cultivate more shared compassion for one another?
Right. But, you asked how have I been transformed and changed? I'm not sure I'd be the person I am if I didn't do this work. I hope I'd always be a compassionate and empathetic person, but you can't help but do this work and not walk in other people's shoes.
So the last guidepost C is about connected to a strong support network. And you've already spoken so much about the incredible community and relationships that you've built. How did you actually build these meaningful, authentic relationships across so many differences? How might that guide some of us who may be inspired by your words to reach out and to build some bridges?
With the civil rights work I do in the civil rights community, I flew to the Deep South. I did a trip myself before I started doing this. I went to all these places. I went to Atlanta, Montgomery, Selma, Birmingham, Alabama, Meridian, Mississippi, Hattiesburg, Mississippi, Jackson, Mississippi, Little Rock, Arkansas, and Memphis, Tennessee. And I thought, what is moving me in these different places? What is hitting me? And how can I transform this into a transformative lesson for young people and adults? And then I made some phone calls, and I'll never forget the 98-year-old woman I was telling you about. Her name is Ellie Damer, Dahmer, one more time, whose husband was murdered in 1966. By the way, it says on his tombstone, if you don't vote, you don't count. That is on his tombstone. I met with her 20 some odd years ago, and I said, Mrs. Damer, this is what I want to do. Would you meet with my students? And she said, no, I won't. And I said, may I ask why? She said, because all people want to do is talk about how my husband died. And I said, Mrs. Damer, my promise to you is his death is part of the story, but every lesson I do on every civil rights speaker, the story is how they lived. Their death may be part of their story, but it has to be about their life. Ellie Damer, 98 years old, has met now over 100 of my groups that I brought. And she meets every group. And she gives them time, as do her 2 kids who were in the house as well when their father was murdered. And so my promise to each group is each person, each civil rights speaker, no one will be ripped off. Ripped off is you can meet somebody, not know the story, and you could farce it and say, hey, look who I met. The deep dive is the educational work beforehand that the speakers oftentimes sit in now as we do the lesson, documentary footage. And how great is it when you're showing footage and you can pause a DVD or whatever you're showing and say, would you please comment on that because you're in this video? And it's pretty incredible to happen. And so those are the connections that is formed, making my guarantee that no one would ever feel ripped off. And then one person leads to another. You know, Jeff, I want you to meet this person. I think they'd be a great asset. I mean, the who's who of who we meet. And if I may say just some names, so if anybody wants to look them up because people don't know them. Congressman John Lewis met over 95 of our groups before he passed away. We meet a woman named Joanne Bland in Selma. She should be the mayor of Selma. She was 11 years old on the bridge when her sister was beaten on Bloody Sunday, crossing the bridge with John Lewis. Sarah Collins, who was blinded in the church bombing at age 12 in Birmingham, Alabama, where 4 little girls were murdered. Sarah Collins was blinded. She meets every group we bring. We have Minnie Jean Brown and Elizabeth Eckford, 2 of the Little Rock Nine, who are incredible. Angela Lewis, who is James Chaney's daughter. 3 young civil rights workers were murdered in Philadelphia, Mississippi. Angela was 10 days old. She was the daughter of James Chaney. She never knew her dad. She talks about the father she never knew, brings him to life. The Damer family talks about their father and who he was, giving back to his community and making such a difference. We meet Rena Evers. Rena Evers, whose father was murdered on the driveway of her home at 8 years old. Then she came out and saw her father lying in his own blood and said, get up, Daddy. Daddy, please get up. Rena shares her father and who his life was. It's amazing. When we meet Rena, we meet her at the house and on the driveway where her father was murdered. Every time we're there, a wind comes through. Rena will say, hi, Daddy. It's her father passing through. So it's a who's who of the civil rights movement for us. Many of them are in their 70s, many are in their 80s, and we have some in their 90s. So this knowledge has to be passed on. Myrlie Evers had shared with me at one time, she wanted to shield her kids from the horror. She's the wife of Medgar Evers, of the horror they went through. And she said, it was a mistake my generation made. Myrlie Evers is now 91 years old. It was a mistake my generation made, because once you lose a generation, you don't get it back. So we have to make sure we don't lose any more generations. They must know, I don't call this Black history at all. It is our shared American history. It is really important that Latino history, Asian history, women's history, trans history, the gay rights movement, the Arab American civil rights history, it is our shared history that we must know and acknowledge. This is why I argue what I do should never be taught in February. I know it's Black History Month. I get why they do it. I'm glad it's acknowledged. This should be all taught in September, October, November, December, January. I'd skip February, shortest month of the year, March, April, May, and June, because it's our shared history. And my last piece, and it's kind of, these are 2 controversial pieces. The first piece is, if you parcel out each month, February is Black history, we have Latino history, we have Asian history, then who are we saying U.S. history is really for? It's for white people. And this is why it has to be our shared history. The other piece, and I was called into a superintendent's office saying this line, the people in the civil rights movement, and including the other movements I've talked about, they, in my opinion, are the real founding mothers and fathers of this country. These are people who believed in real freedom, who are not in our history books. They may get a picture, maybe a line, maybe a paragraph, but they're usually not in our history books. Unlike Washington and Jefferson, who are slave owners. And we've been brought up with Washington and Jefferson since kindergarten through high school. So I was called into the superintendent's office, and the associate superintendent said to me, did you call the founding fathers racist? Because I've had a parent complain. If you own other people, that makes you racist. Yes, doesn't mean they didn't do amazing things for this country, but we must speak truth. We must acknowledge racism. And we must acknowledge it in the founding fathers of our country. And we don't even talk about the founding mothers, because we have so many founding mothers in the civil rights movement who don't get acknowledged. Trayvon Martin's mom, after hearing her podcast and seeing her activism, She is a new day founding mother of this country, unfortunately brought to be a founding mother by tragedy. But her voice needs to be heard, a founding mother of our country who needs to be heard. So I say we must turn this institution upside down and acknowledge who the real founding mothers and fathers of our country are.
So powerful. We are at the point in the conversation now where I invite you to give me and anyone listening who wants to say yes a challenge. And so I'm going to make one request myself and then leave it also completely open to you. If we were to start with one or two sources, either films or books, some things that you share with your students on the trips, if we want to try to go deeper in this work of understanding our shared history better, what would you invite us to read or learn about? And then what other challenge would you give us that would help us more fully step into our own personal activism, each one of us, our own transformation that's authentic to us? How would we uncover that?
Well, unfortunately, too many of us have to be self-educated, because if teachers don't know this, how can we pass this on? Minnie Jean Brown, who I've talked about a number of times, she and I were on CNN a number of years ago. And she was asked on CNN, do you get frustrated people don't know who you are? They may know Little Rock Nine, but they don't know Minnie Jean. And Minnie Jean gave the best answer I've ever heard. She said, if they don't know who I am, it's not their fault. It means we haven't taught them.
Yeah.
So our mantra is we have to self-educate. I mean, there are so many books. I'll talk about a woman named Isabel Wilkerson. She has incredible books out there. Books like Slavery by Another Name is an incredible book. Caste is an incredible book that people should read. The civil rights books that have guided me, there's a couple of them. John Lewis has a book out called Walking with the Wind. For young people, he's made it into a graphic novel now. Now, I'm not of the graphic novel generation. He has 4 volumes as a graphic novel. But Walking with the Wind, which came out, I believe, in 98, I call it the Bible of what I do. There are books about Little Rock that are amazing. One that I love is Elizabeth Eckford's It Is Her Coming Out Party. It took her over 50 years to tell the author her story. It's by a man named David Margolick. It is called Elizabeth and Hazel, Two Women of Little Rock, a book that I like. Now, not everyone likes it, but for me, it is Elizabeth's story, and it's incredible. I think we have to acknowledge who a woman named Dolores Huerta is. People think Cesar Chavez did so much of the farm workers movement. Well, it's important to acknowledge the farm workers movement was also a Filipino movement. It wasn't just about Mexicans. And Dolores Huerta was instrumental in that with Cesar. There's a movie I just saw called A Song for Cesar. It's by a friend of mine who came on the trip. It's an incredible documentary through music and art about the history of the farm workers movement that I think everyone should watch. And it acknowledges Filipinos and their contributions. So there are so many. And if anybody contacts you, and maybe you'll give our website out, and they could also contact me because my email's on our website.
Absolutely.
And they wanted more books and recommendations, we have a whole list of what we send out. So everyone on the trip gets a whole litany of books, movie recommendations, documentary recommendations, and then a whole sheet of quotes that are related to speakers in the civil rights movement.
Okay. So you'll give me the link that I can include for that?
Yeah, I will have it sent to you. And
why don't you say out loud where your website is so anybody that's listening that wants to immediately go there can?
Our website is www.sojourn, SOJOURN, project, one word, sojournproject.org. And if people want to email me, I am jeff@sojournproject.org. By the way, we take community members. So if anybody listening, including Julie Neal, wants to come on a journey, you're always invited to come. We have a trip in August where we're taking police and district attorneys. You're welcome to come, even though being in the South in August is not always fun. We have a trip in November where we're taking a middle school to the DC area and doing the civil rights movement in DC. And then we have one in April that is a high school trip. And many people come on the high school trip, parents, community members. If you want to come on the police DA trip, there's community members coming on that as well. So just know you are invited, standing invitation. And again, there's an urgency to do this work because we've lost 10 to 15 speakers since I started this 24 years ago. And many of our speakers are getting older. So to meet them now, somebody has said to me, will this continue when all the speakers are gone? This work will continue because children of speakers will want to share their parents' stories. So I'm positive it will continue, but there's nothing like meeting the real people now.
So I want to personally commit. Being on a Sojourn trip has been on my life bucket list for a long time.
Yeah.
So I want to declare I am definitely going to come on the trip. It would be a dream to bring my mom, who has always instilled in me a lot of the tenets of social justice. And I know cares a lot about the civil rights movement, lived through aspects of it herself. And surprisingly, my youngest is graduating from elementary school and will actually be a middle schooler. So I'm going to at least explore the possibility of maybe being on a trip with Jacob and maybe my mom. But what's some other invitation you might have for anybody listening that you would like us to do in terms of stepping into our own transformative activism?
Well, Julie Neal, you're my sister because we're doing similar work. It may be different methods of getting there, but the work is so similar. So being connected is so important. What I really admire about you, and I'm sure your listeners, is you are so authentic. And it's really important to have authenticity. People have said to me, Jeff, you'd be an incredible salesman. I would be a terrible salesman because it's about the passion you have for this work. And I think passion goes a long way. And Julie, your passion to what you do is authentic and using your voice. And I would just challenge anyone out there. How can you be allies for people who need allyship? How can you be supportive and how can you be authentic? There's different ways to do it. Financially is one way. The written word is another, writing to papers, writing to stations that may be putting on news that should not be shown of particular people who get way too much time, and going to meetings and supporting people, writing to our legislators. There's one more piece to acknowledge here. I've heard every criticism there is about this work I do. One criticism, and you don't have to include it if you don't want to, is how can a white guy be teaching our history? And what I answer to that is, can a person of color teach about the Holocaust? Well, of course they can, better than many Jewish people can teach about the Holocaust, because it's not about what you look like. It is about your passion and your dedication and making a guarantee you will give good faith efforts every lesson you do. I've done 114 trips. So I've done these lessons 114 times. Every time I do them, it has to be acted is the wrong word. It has to be given that it's almost like the first time I've done it, because people need to feel the energy and the passion and the commitment to the work we do. Julie, how many podcasts have you done now?
Yours will be my 103rd.
You never let the person you're speaking to know that, oh my goodness, this is the 103rd time I've done this. You are 153rd. You are so authentic and you make me feel like this is the first time we've done this. And I think that adds to just the credibility of who you are.
Well, Jeff, thank you. We always end every episode with acknowledgments, and I feel like you've already moved into that. And every reflection that you've shared about how you see me and my work and how I've helped you to feel during the interview, I take in and I so deeply appreciate. It's so meaningful to me. I want to reflect some of the things that I appreciate in you and that I'm taking from this conversation. I think that you modeled for me years before I ever said yes to Mother's Quest, the power of creating something of our own that's meaningful, that's based on our own life journey, and that's authentic to the contribution that we can make. So thank you for saying yes to your epic life and to creating Sojourn Project and to lighting the way for me in that way. I also want to thank you today for some themes that I'm leaving with, which is a reminder that the universe is on the side of justice, especially when things right now are feeling just so awful in Israel and Palestine, in our own country, to hold that sense of faith, a reminder in the belief that we each have our own transformational path to follow, that activism can take many forms, and that we can all be truth tellers in our own way. So thank you for this time. And I know that so many people will be inspired and also challenged by the things that you shared honestly with us today.
And not everyone has to agree. I think everyone has to speak their own truth and their own authentic voice. And that's what you do. That's what I'm trying to do. And my last thing I'd like to share with you, what you're so good at, there's a lot of people who get compliments who deflect them. And Minnie Jean has a daughter named Spirit. So it's such a beautiful name. And Spirit's such a beautiful person. And she has her own podcast as well, Spirit Tafik. But what Spirit says is when somebody compliments you, because she's not good at taking them, she says, just let it wash over you. And I love that line. And it's what I'm trying to do. So Julie, I hope you're letting all this wash over you because it is well deserved.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you so much for coming along with me on this episode of the Mother's Quest podcast. I hope this conversation sparked something that will help you live your epic life. If you'd like to get show notes and learn more about how to join the Mother's Quest community, visit mothersquest.com. And while you're there, I would love it if you would follow the prompts to subscribe, leave a review on Apple Podcasts, and help us to spread the word. I want to end with some words to help light the way on your quest. Seize the day, love your people, honor your gifts. Until next time.